Hello and welcome to Long-Term Leadership with my dear friend of almost many, many decades. Let's just leave it at that. Timothy Patrick McCarthy, Dr. McCarthy.
Hello. Great to be here.
It's so fun. It's so fun that we get to have this conversation. So for those of you who I don't know, who are out there in the internet world or listening on the podcast or a replay, my name is Beth Napleton, and I am a consultant, coach, and an expert in working with leaders to help them reach their goals. And as someone who loves thinking about leadership and kind of all its complexities, I do these lives as a way to learn about the lessons of leadership from a variety of perspectives. And fortunately for me, I've been able to have a lot of those people alongside me on my journey, including Tim, who I met when I believe I was 18 years old.
Are we gonna do the numbers and the math? Let's keep it a little vague. When we were younger, yeah.
When we were younger, but it's like shocking because we were going out for drinks together before I was allowed to go out for drinks legally.
You were. I had nothing to do with that. I just went along. I didn't ask questions. No questions.
I just saw you there. I was not in charge of enforcement, but yes, lots of good nights in the wonderful bars around Columbia University.
Yes.
Where maybe more of a natural habitat for us. But here we go in the Zoom world.
Yes, of course. I love it. I remember those days fondly.
Oh my gosh, so many good memories, and does not seem like as many years ago as it was. No. I mean, there's just not even close. So yes. Right. So, when Tim and I met, you were a doctoral student at Columbia, working in history, but his biography now is really amazing. I'm like, look at how many books you've published, how many movies you've been a part of. I'm like, you were my buddy who was like,
This is where you start to add up the years. This is what.
Yeah, you're like, hey, I don't feel like it was that long ago, but you are a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. You teach a class at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, the only class on LGBTQ matters still. So that's a separate aside.
At least there's one.
Exactly. You're holding down the fort as usual there, right? And you've taught at Harvard for over 2 decades, and you're not just a historian. I feel like sometimes people could say, "Oh, you have a doctorate in history," and you're not just an educator. Like you're also an activist. I mean, you're someone who's at protests, rebuilding churches. We'll talk a little bit about how we met. Which I guess this is a good segue. Is we met rebuilding churches in Birmingham, Alabama.
That's right.
On an alternative spring break trip through Columbia University, which was really, I think, one of the most magical experiences of my life. I mean, magical might be not quite, but all these people from different walks of life kind of coming together to spend a week rebuilding a Black church that had been burnt down by arsonists in the South in the 1990s. And I don't know if you know, but at the time I was a first year at Barnard and I was very unhappy. I was actively trying to transfer. I felt like this isn't exactly what I thought I was getting into. And on that trip, I felt like I found my people, right? And I was like, oh, this is a great place. Like I could be here. This is like, this is the kind of community I wanted to be a part of. And I feel like it really set my life on a different trajectory.
So. It's so interesting you would say that because I was the same way. I was really miserable too. And I don't think that I was as explicit about this with all of you because I think I was the only graduate.
You were pretty close to being the oldest. Garrett was older too. But
yeah, I think I was the only Columbia graduate student. All the other students were Barnard and Columbia undergrads.
Yes, undergrads,
there was some Vista AmeriCorps folks, like Garrett and Monique and some other folks.
Yeah.
So I was kind of a weird outlier, and I didn't quite make sense on that trip. They're like, who's this guy, right? But I wasn't leading the trip.
He's a grown-up.
The religious, the campus chaplains and rabbis were leading the trip, but I just kind of came on it. And the reason I came on it is because I had a student of mine, Lizzie Simon, actually. Lizzie.
Yeah.
So Lizzie was going to go on that trip, and then for some reason she had a conflict; she couldn't go. And so this is back in the day, right, pre 9/11, where people could just give each other their plane tickets, right? So we just and I go, and so that's what happened. She came into my office hours. She was taking my, I was TFing Eric Foner's course on the American Radical Tradition. I think it was that course. It might have been Manning Marable's course in Intro to African Americans. But it's one of them. I TF both. And Lizzie was in my classes. And she came in and she said, you seem kind of miserable. And I'm doing this thing that feels to me kind of aligned with who you are. And I feel like, and she basically had this conversation, which surfaced the fact that because I had been diving into the kind of reading and writing and scholarship and research of graduate school, which was all great. I had really moved away from some of my more activist and organizing kinds of commitments that I had been very involved in as an undergraduate at Harvard. And this could get you back into that space.
Yeah.
And I said, wait, there are Black churches that are being burned down in the United States? Because, of course, at that point, it wasn't getting much media attention.
No, not at all.
And so, I did. I got her ticket. I changed my name. I paid $50, and I was on the plane with all of you guys. And we we flew into Birmingham, and then we drove on the bus to Greensboro, Alabama, catfish capital of Alabama, and helped to rebuild the Rising Star Baptist Church in Greensboro, Alabama. And that was the first of many trips. We went on 3 together. And I ended up running those trips for 15 years at Columbia and Barnard, and then at Harvard, and then also at UNC Chapel Hill, where I did a stint as visiting scholar, where we met again when you were teaching in
Roanoke. Exactly. When you came,
we're like bad pennies. We keep showing up. And
I know. No, it's so fortuitous, right? You feel like people come into life. I had no idea it was so close, and that just it's like almost gives me chills just to think like, oh my gosh, like thank God for Lizzie Simon's other commitment. I mean, it sure would have been great to go with her, but you really have a lifelong friend.
Well, she's had her own very distinguished career as a writer, activist, and global.
It did not hold her back.
She's done very well for herself.
Good. It was not where my life went up. It did not make hers go down. Right. All rising tide lifts all boats. So yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, you did them for so many years, and I think those trips were just so amazing. So I'm laughing because I know that if anyone is tuning in out there or listening to this later who was on those trips, they are cracking up because we were a little bit notorious. I feel like we hit it off right away. Right. I think we were sleeping in a gym floor. I can't remember which trip.
No, the first trip we were sleeping on army cots, right, in that barracks. Remember?
Yes.
Then we slept on the floor and then in gyms, and
there were lots of less than luxurious sleeping arrangements.
I was gonna say, never a comfortable sleep, right?
No, you always came back and were kind of like this. What's with my back? Like,
if I did them now, I don't do them now, but I did them for 15 years, and towards the end of that time, my back was definitely loving sleeping.
You made it a long time because I think it was my senior year, and I was like, I just don't know if I can do this anymore. It's like 22, like I can't.
But it was worth it, and those trips were, as you said, I mean, for myself, certainly transformative. I mean, they absolutely some of the most important experiences of my life for a million reasons.
And I think it was such an interesting place where, and we'll talk about kind of this intersection, but I think like for me, I was doing, as an American Studies major, really focusing on social justice issues, and I'm doing a lot of learning around this. And then I was also doing a lot of, I ran the community service program at Columbia that worked in New York City public schools. And so it felt like I was doing meaningful work, but it really kind of brought in this element of being responsive to the crises of the present. Black churches that were being burned by arsonists in the
there were over 1,000 in the 1990s.
I mean,
over 1,000.
I mean, and it really, and when you think about the important role, actually, I'm talking to someone next week about faith and leadership. And if you think about the role of the Black church historically in kind of nurturing leaders and cultivating leaders, it is an activist sign. But it was really like a place where I saw where all these pieces could come together, right? Like kind of like your activities and your learning. And then like, how do you take those and apply those to the present moment? And to be clear, neither of us had any construction skills, I think it's fair to say.
I had painted a lot of houses, but I was not a construction.
No. There was like, I remember drywall at some point being like, I maybe should stay away from that. It was just, it was great. So, well, I mean, we're kind of there already, but let's talk, when you look back at that time, and it's so interesting because 15 years is a long time to be doing those trips. And so, and certainly through your time at Columbia, Harvard, UNC, but what did you really kind of take from that point in time? What were you kind of learning and figuring out then? You were maybe 2 years away from your doctorate?
No. I just finished my coursework. I was studying for my exams at that point.
Oh, wow.
So I didn't get my PhD till later. I didn't even start writing my dissertation yet at that point.
Oh, wow.
But I had been studying, my areas of focus were on American radicalism and social justice movements, and then African American history and the sort of long Black freedom tradition, and also the kind of opportunities and also challenges of interracial coalitions, specifically within these broader movements for racial and social justice. And so, this was obviously the trip itself with all of those different kinds of people who were from so many different backgrounds coming together to do this work. I mean, we really were a kind of, a UN delegation going down south with all these different people with different racial and ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, and class backgrounds, and other kinds of backgrounds. And that was remarkable in and of itself because we represented, that kind of coalition and solidarity, which I loved. And then also, I think for me, personally, the idea of getting proximate to the ongoing injustices and violences that are very much tied to this country's like profoundly disturbing and terrifying history of racism and anti-Black racism in particular, and white supremacy, right, and the violence that attends the whole history of that, right? For I think sometimes, you know, when you're studying that historically, there is a sense that, you know, it's you go on the Wayback Machine. It's something that happened in a different time, and this idea that like somehow we've made progress or we moved beyond that. And what that trip did, I mean, it just like shook anyone out of that fiction, right? Or that deception, right? That somehow we've made progress and there's no more racial violence. These were all Black churches that were burned by white arsonists in the 1990s and 2000s. And I mean, one of the churches I worked on later on was a church that was burned the night Barack Obama was elected in Springfield, Massachusetts, down the road from.
Wow.
We didn't always go south. We went out
locally. Yeah.
So that was one piece of it that I think was very important, and it's it's a version of what it's kind of reckoning with the realities of the current day that are linked to all of the injustices, inequities, and violences of the past. That's really important to understand that we can still connect those dots. There's a through line that hasn't ended, right? Even though there are marks of progress and we can sort of celebrate certain kinds of things, right? There is also, you know, a lot of stuff that endures that we inherit. And to get close to it, as my friend Brian Stevenson says, get proximate to the injustice and the inequities. That the only way we're going to understand these things and really do anything about them or be able to do anything about them is to get as close to them as possible. And so that leads me to a second piece of this for me that was important, was that those trips allowed me, right, at that moment, which would have been crucial, where I felt myself moving away from my deep community engagement and activism, particularly around racial justice issues and multiracial coalitions, particularly around those things. It allowed me to kind of align the research I was doing on abolitionism, right, and civil rights and those kinds of movements with like the realities of the present day. And it allowed me to get those two things back together in a way that an undergraduate, when I did anti-apartheid work and other kinds of racial justice work and equity and education work, studying African-American studies, that felt much more intertwined and aligned. Whereas in graduate school, it felt like it was pulling apart. And those trips allowed me to get back to that. But they also did something that I think is really important, and it's a leadership lesson that I learned, which is that they kept calling me back. Those trips kept calling me back to the South. I've helped on 6 Black church rebuilding projects in Alabama alone, right? 2 or 3 in South Carolina, right? Almost every southern state, and then West Virginia and Massachusetts as well. And so for me, the kind of, you got to keep coming back, right? Because like once you sort of connect and establish some kind of credibility and connection to a community, you have to keep doing that. You can't just like earn it once and then bolt or expect that that's going to carry you for the rest of your life. Right. Particularly when you're someone like me, who's a big white guy from New York. I'm a Yankee. Right. Yeah. They used to joke about it. Some of the Black church folks used to be like, how'd you get down here? You know, and it was important for someone like me with white skin and privilege, because of that, a Yankee from New York, right, to keep coming back and to keep like earning that trust. Because there's no way you can do the kind of work that you and I are both committed to doing in the world without constantly earning and renewing that trust
and being so consistent and showing up and getting it's not that I see it and it's done. It's not that like that was a nice thing check, but it's really about committing to, you know, rolling up your sleeves and getting there. And
it was important from we were from Columbia and Barnard, right? And
tons of privilege with that.
Like, why are you kids?
What are you doing?
You know, and to be able, and we're having to confront that question and answer it was really important.
Well, and I think I also hear you describing how this was something that really fed you, right? And kind of like spiritually nourished you to go back to the books and go back to the coursework and, you know, the writing, you know, and so I think that also thinking about as leaders, you know, how do you do that as you progress in your journeys? Because I find that I don't think you were alone. And like, you know, I'm picturing you sitting in your office, right? When Lizzie comes in and thinking like, I've kind of gotten away from what really fed me in this and needing to kind of go back to the source. And I see that a lot with leaders who, take new jobs, and they're really impactful and really big, but it's like, but actually this stuff, I just need to kind of get back in touch with my why, and on a regular basis to renew me, right?
Well, you get this, right? I mean, you've experienced this in your own career, your own remarkable trajectory and accomplishments. I have so many students, right? I teach jointly at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard and at the Kennedy School of Government. So I have students who are in sort of government policy, political realms, and then students who are in educational realms. And so often they come to the Graduate School of Education or to the Kennedy School in order to get more training so that they can do systems level work.
Yes.
Right. So I have a lot of students at the ed school who are classroom teachers, and they've done all sorts of different kinds of work in schools, in classrooms, and they come to the ed school and then they leave the ed school and go do policy work, or they go, the superintendents or principals, school leaders, and many of them, right, report back or even wrestle with while they're there that tension between, the love of being with the kids and being in classrooms and doing lesson plans and, and all of that wonderful energy and satisfaction, and also, labor and
you're the childhood teacher
that comes from being a classroom teacher. But then, when you do the systems work, it's like when you when I was doing those church rebuilding trips, I was a working class graduate student. I was like, I was from pretty humble roots. I mean, I'm not a Harvard professor. I can't claim that I'm, some working class dude anymore. I mean, I was that, and now I've become something different. And I think that whether you're rising up in terms of a different socioeconomic status or a different position in society, or you have a different kind of job description or portfolio, and you're further and further away, like say in education, from the kids. Right, that poses a challenge, right? So sort of like, if what inspired you to do this in the first place was the teaching, the on the ground stuff, the community organizing, whatever it happens to be, if that's the stuff that's proximate, right, is the stuff that inspired you and changed you and transformed you and set you flowing, right, and then you move away from that, right? I think our lives are always a constant kind of negotiation and struggle, and they should be. That tension should, I think, always be there, and it certainly is for me. And I know you and I have talked about this privately. I my husband too. He was a teacher and ran a school, and now is not in schools anymore. But these things are alive and well in our lives. We have to wrestle with them and make choices for the times where we are.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it is too, because there's such a depth of impact that you can make as a classroom teacher, as an organizer, whatever it is. And then there's the hunger to make impact, more broadly and have that breadth. And I do think that we always sit in that moment, right? And always think like, and what's the season of my life? What are the demands at home? What do I want personally or geographically? So, it's interesting. I used to always say that I would, when I retired, I would be a kindergarten teacher, because I always wanted to do that. Felt like I'd have the energy. And then COVID hit and we did virtual kindergarten here with my two sons. And that dream has died.
You're done with that. Yeah. Right.
That's why I'm spending my retirement.
Right.
Those people have the patience of about 75 saints.
Yeah. Every time I complain about anything in my job, my parents, as you know, my mom, Michelle, and Coach Mac are retired public school teachers. So my mom taught for 40 some odd years in elementary schools, and my dad retired as a third grade teacher, and my dad is a high school social studies teacher and basketball coach, and was my basketball coach. And so I come from educators. My grandmother is a teacher, school leader, and so every time I complain, my mother was like, my mother's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Was the faculty meeting hard today?" Because she went to work at like 5:30 in the morning. And taught like overflowing classrooms of kids who were living in poverty. And she did that for 42 years, and she's like had to buy the books for her classroom and wash kids when they came to schools and all this stuff. And and then would come home at like 6 o'clock at night. I mean, she never saw the light of day.
No, always, yeah.
And then she'd be exhausted. Then she'd like cook dinner. She'd do, and she's like, I mean, every time I complain, she always puts it right in my plate. So I was like, fair enough.
Oh, she's they always help keep it real, right?
Yes, my parents keep it all real all the time. Thank God. God bless.
It's so true. So tell me about a time where you learned a leadership lesson and kind of like a profound like light bulb moment. Sometimes I feel like these lessons whisper to us over time, and we learn them, and sometimes it like hits us in the face. Tell me about, and you always tell great stories. So I am really looking forward to this. No pressure.
It's very interesting. I was thinking about this because you told me that this was one of the questions you like to ask folks. And I think, I mean, I have a bunch of them. I mean, there's no shortage of them, really. And I think that one is a tough story to tell, because as you know, shortly after 9/11, or by the time I came back to Harvard to teach in 1998, which is after we met, I was still a graduate student at Columbia, but I was teaching in the history and literature program here. And I was a house tutor, like an RA, in one of the undergraduate residence halls. And so I was, very immersed in undergraduate life and so forth. And I had returned to my activist roots, in part because I had come back to Cambridge, which is where I'd done so much of that work when I was in Boston, where I had done so much of that work as a college student. So it was, I kind of sorted right back into that. And so it's, reconnected with those communities. And then 9/11 hits, right? There were a lot going on at that time. And I, as you know, because of my social justice Catholic upbringing, I'm a pacifist. I'm an anti-war person, and I'm not a nonviolent practitioner, etc. And I immediately protested both Afghanistan and Iraq. Right? Yeah. I was on record very early. Opposed to long before Iraq was ever a thing, Afghanistan. And I really felt, and I still do feel deep in my bones, that these were vengeance wars, right? And that they were unjust, and that it was just sort of like, so we died, so someone else has to die.
Yeah.
And there been so many deaths as a result. But not getting too deep into that. But I spoke out, and I spoke out fairly publicly and at a rally in Harvard Yard about 3 weeks after 9/11. And then several weeks after that, I found out that there was this organization, kind of like a campus watch organization, that was founded by Lynn Cheney, the second lady, Dick Cheney's wife.
Right, at the time she certainly,
And they issued a report that was called Defending Civilization. And it was basically a report that was meant to say that, like, American academics are, quote, short on patriotism, and therefore a kind of threat to the war effort at a time of when we need to all kind of close ranks and engage with our patriotism, and by implication support the war and support the Bush Cheney policies and foreign policy. And of course, I wasn't going to do any of that, but there was an appendix to this report where they listed 132 American academics who were, quote, short on patriotism and a sort of a threat, right? And that were, like, corrupting our young people, basically. So it was a blacklist of sorts. Right?
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like the McCarthy.
Yeah, it was it certainly was an attempt.
I'm a historian, but I see the parallels. Yeah.
Right, and with my last name, McCarthy, blacklist or not, is something that I'm unfamiliar with. No relation, of course, to Joe McCarthy at all. Or different McCarthys. But still, whether or not it was like a blacklist per se, it was certainly an attempt to intimidate, to publicly shame or call out, and an attempt, I thought, to chill the speech and to silence dissent. And so so that happened, and I happened to be the only person on the Harvard faculty who was on that list. And so, it had wonderful people on it. Both Manny Noble and Eric Foner, my mentors in graduate school, were on that list. Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, Angela Davis, right? All of my, all my people.
Good company,
many of my mentors were on that list. So I was in good company, right, in that way. But I was the only one here, and I was so vulnerable. I didn't have my dissertation. I didn't have my PhD yet. I was teaching. I was on like a 1-year renewable contract. Like I served at the will of whoever. Like I was deeply vulnerable, and also not like well off financially.
Right. This is not like the thing you did for fun, right? This is your thing.
It was just, and I was terrified. I got hate mail and death threats and all these things, and it was a terrible time. I won't go into all the details, but it was a very lonely time. And that's the lesson I learned, I think, in that moment, which was like very shocking, very terrifying. It's hard to imagine, you have to go back to like October of 2001.
Yeah.
Nobody opposed the war in Afghanistan.
No. It was like basically considered a done deal, right?
Neither people were just like, oh, of course we have to go. But there weren't a lot of outwardly public opposition.
People
there were some.
Wait a second, right?
There were some, and they were all on that list. But so for me, as a young person, I just turned 30, right? I had just come out of the closet. I had it's a very precarious situation. I hadn't yet finished my PhD. I was very, very vulnerable, and I just felt so alone in that moment. Not that there weren't people who did have my back, but I really felt very alone. And as a result, there were lots of like long nights where I didn't, get a lot of sleep, where I really did doubt myself, and I doubted not my opposition to this. I never doubted my principles or my values. But I did doubt whether or not I should have spoken out as loudly as I did, whether or not I had totally screwed my career and my job prospects, whether or not I was, going to suffer some kind of violence as a result of it. All of that was stuff I worried about. How it was going to affect my family. At the time, I was helping to raise my little brother from the Big Brother Big Sister program, and he was in high school at the time. He was a sophomore in high school, and he was going to the high school. He was living with me part-time and going to the high school nearby Harvard, and how it was going to affect him and how it was going to affect our family, and all of that was in my head, and it was messy, and I think what I learned from that is like when you feel something that feels like it's rooted in your gut, like your values, right? Your principles, like the deeply held stuff that's non-negotiable, right? And your first impulse is to act on that. You should go with
the right thing to do.
Right? Like, and not let all the other voices,
the noise, or the intimidation
get in the way. And so sometimes you do have to just speak your truth. And that was one lesson. And then the other lesson I learned, I think, for me was that it's that this is gonna be lonely sometimes.
Yes.
And that being a leader, but a moral leader, not a just like having power or privilege or status, but like being someone who's willing to speak a certain kind of truth, even if you're a party of one, right, is by definition a very lonely existence. Over time, it becomes less lonely, right? I mean, when we look back now, right, I've been vindicated.
Yes.
I've been vindicated, right? And I mean, Dick Cheney should be tried for war crimes, probably, and like my position on that was steady, consistent, principled,
and for over 20 years, right?
And so history, and that's another thing about being a historian, I think that sometimes you realize you take the long view. And I'm like all the people who were outspoken in the past, who were caricatured and maligned and marginalized and silenced and imprisoned, like all of those folks ultimately get their light of day in history, right? Most of them, if you wait long enough. And so, I don't think I had that in my head at the time. But anyway, so those are the things that, sort of like speak your truth and be okay with being alone for a time.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because I think that like, it's one thing to know these things from studying history. It's another thing to feel that loneliness and to have had that sleepless night. And I think about, a text I used a ton with my students was Letter from Birmingham Jail. And like, at the end of the day, it's like, it's such like a revered text. It's a beautiful piece of work. It's, you could buy it in any bookstore now. But, you have to think, like, what is it like to sit alone in a jail cell while your young children are at home and your wife, and you're writing this letter, and, is your life in jeopardy? Like, the way that feels.
Oh, and his life was always in jeopardy.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and, clearly.
As was his wife's and their kids.
Their whole, so you just like that, there's a loneliness. Like, I think, Dr. King, and of course, it's like, but, that must have been very difficult, right? And
well, he wrote about this. One of my favorite photographs of King, actually, and I want to be very clear. I'm not equating myself to Dr. King anyway, anything near that. I'm not going that, although I admire his principles on war and justice and poverty and civil rights. Certainly he's an inspiration. But one of my favorite photographs is a photograph of him, and it's a kind of dimly lit photograph. He's at his writing desk, and it must be some dark outside. It must be evening, or I imagine it to be evening. And there's a sort of light from the lamp that's like projecting on his face, and he's just sitting there, kind of like in contemplation, and he's looking. And the way I interpret his image and is that he's very concerned. He's like, the weight of the world is on him, and he's not sure what to do. He's like contemplating what to do and how to do it. And I think that happened a lot. If you go to the parsonage at the Dexter Street Baptist Church, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, which is where he had the first time he was pastor, and he arrives there. Still a doctoral student, right? He goes, he's a doctoral student at BU. He's finishing his dissertation. He's 26 years old. I think they have one kid at the time. They've just been married, and they moved to Montgomery. He's the pastor of the church. Montgomery bus boycott's already being planned, right? So I always say that, the movement made the man didn't make the movement. And there's a story that they tell. One of the women who took us through one time when I was down there was the babysitter of the children when they were young. So she's an much older woman now.
Who,
she would take us in, and she tells the story about King sitting at the table in the kitchen where he is about to sort of quit, right? Where he's just like, I don't think I have it in me. right? Because the house had been bombed. There's still a dent on the front porch where there had been a bombing of the house, and he had a tiny baby, newlywed, and he's young, and the doubt he had all the time, and the more you read into the Harvey Milk left a lot of records, and King, and so many of these people left records, diaries, letters, oral history accounts, and so forth, speeches, where they really do talk about those really private times of doubt and loneliness and so forth. And I just don't know very many people who try to be leaders, particularly moral leaders, right? Where you have some felt responsibility to an ethical, just kind of life. That don't feel those things. As a kind of matter of course, pretty often.
It comes with it, and it's there's so many examples, right? Exactly. Well, and let's kind of segue, because I think you bring, so speaking of moral leadership, thinking about, I think also, which to me is also speaks to a leadership that just comes from like deep in your soul, right? It's about a cause or a set of values that you just like, that's where your allegiance is to, right? And this is not like up for discussion. It's not a change your mind situation, right? I mean, and so I think, you think about it with the historian perspective, particularly with your focus on radicals, and, a current day professor who's such an influential mentor to so many students. I mean, when you think about moral and authentic leadership, kind of past, present, and future, it's but what is your perspective? Because I feel like you're at this interesting intersection where you're really, it's cliche in education to say it, but it's true. Like, you're working with the leaders of tomorrow, right? Well, but also about helping to, like, where have we been and what can we learn from that so that we can go forward in a better way?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one piece of it for me is that I'm always trying to the extent that I can, and obviously, none of us is close to perfect. I certainly am not. I try to model what I'm trying to teach, and I'm trying to model what has been modeled for me, because we're all influenced by models of behavior. And that can be negative, it can be positive. And I've been really lucky that both in my own life with my family, my parents and grandparents, and then with my mentors and teachers over the years, and then my students now and other people in my life, but also with all those examples from history of people who have really who have tried to model an alignment between what they say and what they do. Right? And Stephen Carter, who's a scholar and writer that I am very moved by, who's a law professor at Yale, wrote a book called Integrity, and it's a kind of meditation on integrity and where it comes from and what it is. And one of the things that he does in the book is he says that there's this kind of set of reflections that we have to set of a kind of process that we have to go through. And one is, the first stage is moral reflection, sort of like thinking deeply about what it is that what our values are, like what it is that makes us tick, our why, right? And our non-negotiables, and sort of thinking about where that comes from. What are the root of our values, and how are our values those roots moving forward? Then thinking about what he calls moral resilience, which is once you've figured out what those values are and what's important, what's right or wrong, then you have to like live that. You have to you have to go walk the walk, and you have to walk the walk not just once or a couple of times. You got to do it ongoingly, which is why I call it moral resilience. Right? It's something you do in an ongoing way. It's not a one-off, right? It's not a sort of like just for a period of time. It's like a constant putting into action or walking what it is that you are have identified the things that are right and wrong. And then he has this third phase where he talks about moral expression, or what moral philosophers might call moral articulacy, the ability to then say and express and explain to people what it is that makes you tick, the answer to the why question, right? And why questions. And I think that to me, I love it. Excuse me, it's particularly good. So I should say I'm recovering from COVID. I was
like, you are just fighting the good fight here. Yeah,
I'm fighting the good fight here.
Take a break. We're all
is lingering, but I'm beyond. I'm not contagious anymore. I'm here. But it's still there's still residue. And so what I love about it, especially in my courses on leadership and communications and talking about moral leadership, is that he really is trying to get us to the walk and the talk aligned. Right?
Yes,
and that the closer you get those things into alignment, the more integrity you have, right? And then the more integrity people are going to perceive in you, they're going to be like, he or she or they walk the talk, right? They don't just talk, they walk, and they're constantly trying to align those things. I think that's really important. The other thing that he does is that you have to reflect first, then you have to act, then you talk about it.
Talking comes at the end. That's what I was thinking of. Like, that's so interesting.
Talking comes at the end, and you and I are talkers, right?
Talk is cheap. I mean, I hate to say it, it's our gift, but it's cheap.
I mean, my father was.
We also walk the walk, to be fair.
Well, hopefully we try to. My dad said I was vaccinated with a phonograph needle, and Timmy talks too much was a constant refrain in elementary school. But this has been actually quite helpful for me, and there are other things that have influenced my thinking on this. But this idea that this moral reflection as a central part of how we live in the world, and then really trying to, in an ongoing way, put that into practice, and then like develop a capacity to talk about it, to articulate it to the world.
Yes.
And it reverses, I think, sometimes, because sometimes we like talk the talk and then we walk the walk.
Right.
It's the reverse, and then more reflection comes before that. And I love that as a kind of framework for understanding things. And so that's, for me, that's there. The other thing too is that authentic leadership, which is a part of moral leadership, or they're a part of each other, for me, is also like speaking clearly and speaking directly and speaking honestly, and not obfuscating, not speaking with euphemisms, not speaking through consultants and poll testers and in politics. So often people are saying, the general counsel's office. I mean, everything at Harvard gets filtered through 7 different offices, and it's always about whether or not they're going to get sued. And it's just like, and so as a result, the people, the official people, the leaders of the institution, this is everywhere, it's not just at Harvard, are always sound like they've been crafted by lawyers and communications consultants. And it's like, and that's not authentic leadership. Like, you're hiding behind a phalanx of filters.
Yes.
And for me, authentic and moral leaders are people who don't need that.
No.
Because they've done that work.
Yes.
And that's what matters. And I think that's where people establish credibility and trust and connection and empathy and those kinds of things. And I believe deeply in all of that.
Absolutely. It's interesting because I think, when we think about when I think about what you just talked about, and I look around at the world, like, I'm not overwhelmed with examples of people who I think of. Some names are coming to mind, and I'm like, no, but there are also many examples, right? And I think of people in that way. When you think about, like, what do you see as the top barriers to authentic leadership? And I don't know if maybe that's at a system level, maybe it's as like us as humans, right? Like people craving attention or wanting to be influential. But, I think that so many leaders I work with, I think, want to be true to who they are and kind of lead as authentically as possible. But it can feel difficult. They're in institutions that they've revered and now are leading. They have impactful jobs. They're visible in the community, right? So that their words carry a different weight than they did in other positions. And so I think that people want to do this, but feel like it's difficult. And I'm curious, like, what do you see as some of the barriers, and how do people who want to be authentic leaders? I think there's a whole lot of people who don't. Let's be clear. I'm not sure that, Rick DeSantis is so interested in.
Well, there's some people who couldn't be because they don't know how to do it.
Right. There's no moral base. Yeah.
My first impulse is to say power, and power in 2 different directions. Power, those people who have the most power in society are often the most inauthentic people.
Yes.
And either amoral or immoral people that we have. And yet they have all this status, right, and position. And I think that sometimes that power, right, means that, like, reading it more generously, is that there's always a target on you, and there's always always people ready to take you down. And so you're vulnerable in that way. Even though you have a lot of power and status, you're still vulnerable in terms of, public shaming or calling out or whatever, cancel culture, whatever. But there's also this thing that, like, the more power you get, that what you get preoccupied with is keeping the power. And also the distance that exists between you and the we people, right? And so power gets in the way of authentic leadership, I think, and moral leadership way too often. I mean, I have worked with many people, university presidents, CEOs, people who are run, executive directors of nonprofits, right, who want to do, or say they want to do something, and then they don't because they don't think they can, because of a funder, or because of a donor, or because of a board of trustees, or because of whatever. And so power gets in the way in that way, and power also gets in the way in the other way, because so often when we think about leadership, we're looking up. We're not looking down or around. And for me, the most authentic leadership I see are from like kids.
Yes,
and community organizers, and like folks who work, in trade jobs and skills jobs and things like that. I mean, there are all sorts of folks around, this campus, right? I'll just take my own campus, right? All sorts of folks in this campus or this city or this community who are authentic communicators and leaders and moral leaders, right? Who live their lives in these really powerful and profound and inspiring and aligned ways, right? Who are so much more interesting and inspirational as role models for that kind of thing than like the president and the provost or the mayor, or actually our mayor is really good, but like, people are in charge.
Exactly. Like the people that,
And that's the thing for me that so power works in both those ways, because if we think about leadership as people who have power or position or privilege in some way, right? We're not paying attention to everyone else. We're not paying attention to the folks when you look down or around. And I don't mean down in the sense of like looking down or being patronizing. I mean looking down like to the street, to the grassroots, to the real world, right, where people live and where most people live and exist, and looking down from the pedestal that the people
the hierarchy.
So that to me, so power operates, I think, to kind of to get in the way of authentic and moral leadership in both ways, because we're not allowing more examples to flourish. Because we're looking at a very, very small group of elites, of people who have a kind of privileged and powerful position. And I think that we have to dismantle that understanding of leadership if we care about authentic and moral leadership.
Right.
And then some people don't care about authentic moral leadership.
Societally, I think that question is real unresolved. Right.
Yeah. But I also think, and it's one thing for like someone who's the head of a hedge fund to not be interested in that kind of thing, or a bank, or, whatever. But if you're the head of a school, or you're the head of a political party, right? Or you're the elected political representative of a person, right? Like you're the head of a nonprofit that tries to intervene in homelessness, like you better get to working on trying to become more authentic and more of a moral leader, because that's, otherwise, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I also would say that the hedge fund managers and the
all
the presidents and prime ministers, they could also, stand to do that. But I think, if you're in a field or a sector or a profession or a kind of a world where you're, doing work that is really on the kind of right side of justice and rights and equality and freedom, then you have a special, I think, responsibility to get to aligning the walk and the talk.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I think about also how, our teachers and our mentors and our professors, right, are often those examples that we look to in our lives who shape us. And I think that, I never was fortunate enough to be able to take a course with you, but you've taught, I would guess, thousands of students at this point.
Tens of thousands of students,
which is amazing. And I know that you were telling me about the BRAVE framework that you had developed in your courses on leadership. And I thought that would be I thought it was fantastic. And I think I would love to hear a little bit about what it is and its origin story, and leaders think about it.
So I mean, that's the other way that I date myself, is I'm now in the tens of thousands of students that I've taught. This is my 27th year of teaching.
That is awesome. You're going from Michelle's 42 years.
Yeah. I mean, I started when you knew me as a TA for these classes, and here I am still. So the BRAVE framework that I came up with is something that emerged, I think, iteratively over time out of this course that I taught. First, it was called The Arts of Communication. And now it's called Real Talk, the art and practice of brave communication. And one way that it's evolved, which gets at the BRAVE framework, is that I found more and more that my students were coming to me with questions about like how to navigate situations where they felt like they had regret, or they felt that they had not stepped up or spoken up or been a upstander rather than a bystander, or been willing to be the first one to suggest something or say something that really needed to be said. And so often I was finding these students in education, in business, in government, public policy, who were, trying to figure out, like, how can I be braver?
Yeah.
How can I be more courageous in the way that I communicate? And so I sort of thought, well, okay, let's find some models for that. And so I redid my syllabus, and I went out and tried to find examples of whistleblowers or examples of activists or advocates, people who were the first to step out or stand out speak up about something. People who were in positions of power who did things, maybe they evolved and did something like Obama, coming out in favor of marriage equality, or Lyndon Johnson coming out in favor of voting rights or civil rights, after having been a little bit more reluctant or hesitant to come out about that early on. So some people evolve into bravery. Most of us evolve.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we evolve, right?
We either evolve into bravery or we devolve from it. And so, so I that was part of it, was that my students kept asking me questions about how they could become braver. And then I also, part of it was that I saw them doing this over the course of the term in the various assignments, and they would grow over the term. And I love that. And they also used the class in the classroom, in their community in the classroom, to take risks that they might not take in their professional settings or out in the real world. And I always say to them, this is the lowest stakes environment you're ever gonna be in. You're never gonna lose a job, right? Get canceled, right? Like, receive a death threat for anything you're gonna do in this class. Yeah. So practice what it means to be brave. Yeah. So over time, I came up with this idea because I wanted to push them more. I wanted to push students not just to become more effective and impactful public speakers. I wanted them to become braver people, right? And to help each other, all of us, me too, to become that. And I've become braver, I think, because of this experience. So the framework, BRAVE, is an acronym, and the B stands for Be Bigger and Bolder Than You Are Now. Right? Bigger and bolder than you are now. That's going to mean different things. What's big and bold for you and big and bold for me may look different and sound different, and that's fine. Bigger and bolder. What does bigger and bolder look like and sound like for you? So be bigger and bolder is the B. Real, or R, is keep it real. This goes back to the honesty, directness. Don't obfuscate. Don't euphemize. Right? Keep it real. Say what you want to say. Yes. The A is acknowledge risk and assess consequence, because you can't ethically tell people, even yourself, you can't say be brave in every scenario, right? Like every day you need to speak truth to power. You need to risk your job. You need to blah blah blah. The fact of the matter is that this requires you to, in some cases, courage and vulnerability are not unrelated. Yes, right? Yes. Some people are already vulnerable. Some of us are vulnerable when we wake up in the morning, we walk out into the world, right? Yes, yes. And so, people are already vulnerable without making themselves more vulnerable. And maybe we don't do that. Maybe there are times where we're not as big and bold and brave as we'd like to be, but we need to be honest about acknowledging that there are risks to this, right? This is not easy. Right? And it doesn't come without consequences. So we have to acknowledge the risk and then assess the consequences, which requires reflection, right? And strategy, right? In terms of, it's not just an impulse, right? And an action. It's also something that we think about intentionally and strategically. So that's the A, acknowledge risk and assess consequence. Then the V is lead with values, right? I talk all the time. We do a lot of values work in my courses. We're like, what's at the root of things, right? What's the answer to the why? Why am I who I am? Why do I do what I do? And why do I do it the way I do it? So think about those why questions, and then the origin, origin and evolution story of those values. Right? So where do they come from? Your parents, your faith, right? A challenge, a crisis, right? What happened? And then the E is to engage with power. So, and it means two things. It's a double entendre. Engage with power, meaning speak truth to power. Engage with dynamics of power, systems of power. And then also, when you're engage with your own power. figure out where you are most powerful and why, and lead with that.
Yeah.
So that's the Brave framework.
Wow. I mean, it sounds, since we spoke about it a few weeks ago, I've really been thinking about that and thinking about how helpful it is, and honestly, I think about situations professionally. I think about situations personally, right? Where it's like just a way of helping to be more brave in the world.
Yeah.
How long have you been doing it for in your classes? What's the impact been like?
So I reimagined the course when I moved. So I was, for 15 years, I was based primarily at the Kennedy School of Government, yes. at the Kennedy School. And then last year, the dean of the ed school said, hey, we'd like to bring you over here.
Mm-hmm.
We think that the stuff you're doing and the writing you're doing, the research teaching you're doing, principally is really helpful for us, and it really fits in with our master's redesign. So we've just undergone, or we are undergoing, a kind of 3-year redesign of the entire master's curriculum at the ed school. And I've been part of that a little bit, because I had a joint appointment at the ed school, but
yes.
my principal appointment and my center of gravity was at the Kennedy School. And so I moved in July. And so I shifted over, and I moved from the Kennedy School to the ed school, and I still have an appointment. So now it's just flipped. So I still have
yes.
a faculty appointment at the Kennedy School, and I still teach my Queer Nation, my LGBTQ protest policy and politics course. So I'd still do that, and it's a joint listed course with the ed school. But I'm there, and when I moved there, I decided this last summer, I was starting to roll this out a year or two ago in a kind of like testing the waters. See what students thought. And then the pandemic hit, and I realized, people are struggling in all sorts of ways, and we're alienated, and we're isolated, and we're uncertain, and we're fearful, and we're, all of these things that we're experiencing, that we're still experiencing.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is maybe a time for us to while we're all virtual and separated and out of context in some ways, like, this might be the time for us to talk more intentionally about what it would mean to be brave in a world that we are in some cases removed from, but that we will ultimately certainly return to, but we also may remake.
Yeah. I think people did a lot, right? And how do I want to be in the world, and how do I want to show up?
Yeah.
I would imagine it also built a lot of community in your classes for people to be this vulnerable. And I think that connection virtually is even more important, right?
It does. I mean, I was just on it right before we got on. I was on the phone. I had a bunch of student hours, like some virtual office hours with my students. And I was talking to a number of them. And one of them just said to me, she said, I got to tell you, I really enjoyed the class when I was in it. I loved the class when I was in it, but it's had ripple effects. I stood up to someone the other day that I never would have stood up to if I hadn't taken your class, and I felt really brave. And I was like, and I was, oh, great. She's like, no. And there have been a lot of those moments since I took your class, like moments where I realize, like, I am bigger.
I can do this. Yeah.
Braver than I was, 6 months ago.
Oh, that's
great. And, and I'd like to say that, like, this framework is like the reason for that, or whatever, my teaching or whatever, but it's not. That's just a little part of it, right? I'm just like the facilitator, right? In some ways. And, the older I've gotten, the more I realize that, like, I'm part of the learning process as well as the teaching process. And that's been something that's really I've come to over time. And it's interesting because it's a little ironic, because as I become seen more as like an expert, or like a whatever, someone who's been doing this a long time, which is usually what expert means, just means you're old.
It's code for the gray hair.
Yeah, it's code for the, like, oh damn, like, how old are you? And so, so I don't take myself that, as you can probably tell, I don't take myself like super seriously. I never have. Like, I'm always sort of like, I'm kind of absurd, and the world's kind of absurd, and like, this is all absurd. So, like, let's not take ourselves too seriously. Without like being so self-deprecating that we undermine ourselves. But for what I'm realizing is that I like to sort of be part of the community building with my students, and then what happens when you're in that environment is really magical, right? And I had a student years ago in the course evaluation said, I've never been in a space, and she was talking about our class, community. So I've never been in a space where I really felt in my bones that everybody in that class had my back and was rooting for me to succeed. And I'm like, what would it mean to be in work environments environments or family environments or social environments or whatever.
How radically
where you really felt in your bones that everyone was rooting for you to succeed and had your back. Like that would be a beautiful world.
Yeah, that would be amazing and just transformative. It's so true. It's so true. Well, we're going to switch to the lightning round.
Okay.
I always ask folks, these people love to hear kind of what, who you look to, what you're reading, resources you like. So I'll do that as well. Although I'm not sure we've ever been described as lightning in our life.
Yeah. You and I are not lightning
here. One of the reasons we get along so well. So tell me, what is a book that has meant a lot to you that you'd recommend?
Well, the most important book of my life was James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Rocked my world, continues to rock my world. I've read it more than probably any other book. In terms of my teaching, I think Bell Hooks' the late great Bell Hooks' book Teaching to Transgress, which is about education as a practice of freedom, and Thich Nhat Hanh's book The Art of Communicating, where he talks about deep listening and loving speech and how important they are together. Those have really shaped my pedagogy recently and the way that I teach the courses that I teach.
You always have such good book recommendations. I feel like I can picture being back in your Yorkville apartment with the shelves, like the ones behind you. How about another resource? Because we're both readers, and I was an English teacher. Sometimes people get information other ways, so newsletters, websites, podcasts, documentaries, right? But what's another resource that's been really impactful for you?
I go to. I mean, I think for teachers, like I've done a lot of work with Facing History in Ourselves and the Teaching Tolerance Project at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and then Primary Source, which is an organization here in Massachusetts that does a lot of work with teachers and curriculum development and so forth. And so, for educators, I think that those, the Equal Justice Initiative, initiative in Montgomery, like all of those they're all doing such really remarkable things in terms of teaching, particularly around issues of race and justice and identity and power and these kinds of things, which I think are, given the current brouhaha about inclusive curriculum and LGBT stuff and critical race theory and all of these things, I think it's really important for us to sort of lean into, for me at least, all of the places that we can go to gain resources and understanding about history, right, and then bring that into whatever we're doing.
Yes.
Whether it's the workplace or our classrooms or policy making.
Absolutely. What about some mentors who personally who've meant a lot to you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my grandparents and my parents. I mean, I always go back to my roots. As you know, I'm the adopted only son and grandson of public school teachers and factory workers, and that's where I learned my first lessons and my enduring lessons. I was very lucky, hit the jackpot with all those folks, and they're wonderful. Many of them are gone. My parents are still with us, thank God. And then I had some great teachers. I had, Robert Coles was one of my teachers in undergrad. Henry Louis Gates Jr. was a teacher of mine. I had, wonderful teachers in that way. And then I went to graduate school, and I chose Columbia in the history department there because of Eric Foner, the legendary Civil War and Reconstruction historian and biographer of Lincoln. Manning Marable, who's the head of the late, great Manning Marable, who introduced me to Bell Hooks, actually.
Wow.
And back in the day, he was the head of, he was founded the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia, was a huge towering influence on my life. It's kind of like a father figure in many ways as well. So they were wonderful. I also, in graduate school, met some other folks, Howard Zinn, the people's historian, the late, great Howard Zinn. Many of these folks have left us. And he became a very important mentor when I moved back to Boston, but still a student. Manning and Eric introduced me to him, and he took me kind of on as a kind of unofficial graduate student. He was retired by that point, but we used to spend time together, and he was very important to me. Martin Duberman, the great queer historian who was the founder of the first gay and lesbian studies program in the country at CUNY. In the CUNY system. So, I've been really blessed with those folks. And, the thing now that I love is that, my students are my mentors now.
Yes.
Right?
There's so much to learn.
Young folks are my mentors. And I have a friend of mine, a classmate, brilliant educator, just a great great guy, Jeff Livingston, who said, I think he has a T-shirt at our 25th reunion or something. Maybe I saw it on social media, but he said, if you don't have a young person in your life who's your mentor, then you're not doing it right. You know, and I like that. Just when I heard him say that or saw that for the first time, I was like, oh my God, yeah, the truth of that's weighing through me, you know, and he's right. And so now I think, you know, because in part because so many of my mentors have passed away.
Right.
I mean, half the people I just mentioned are passed away or very old.
What happens when you get older, Tim?
You know, so I am definitely gaining inspiration from my students and then from this rising generation of remarkable young people who are, you know, they're challenging us and they're changing the world. And, you know, it just, I want to be as close to them as I can stay.
Yes.
For as long as I have left.
Well, and I think it helps, you know, push you to be bigger and bolder, right? And sometimes as you get older, you're kind of used to things or worn down. And it's like you look at like a Greta Thunberg and you're like, man, I need to step this up.
Right. Yeah. It's like, what am I doing?
You know?
Yeah.
It's so true. What about mentors? I call them mentors from afar. So like people that you don't know, but you really admire and learn a lot about leadership from. So, you know, I learn a lot from Michelle Obama. I don't know her yet. I do think one day we'll be very good friends, but that day has not yet arrived.
Right. You know, I mean, I hope I'm going to get to meet her in May. Jacinda Ardern, is our commencement speaker this year.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And she's someone that I think she's, you know, I don't tend to like to say, you know, the most or the greatest or the best, but you know, she certainly is one of the most remarkable global leaders right now for all sorts of reasons. And I follow her very closely and watched a lot of her speeches. I teach her in my course. So I think she's an example of an authentic and moral leader at the level of prime minister, which is very rare.
Very difficult.
You know, before he passed, again, late great John Lewis, I had and he had been someone for my whole life, really. I had admired and from afar and had been a real moral compass and North Star for many of us. And then I got to meet him late in his life and spent a couple of times with him, and one very meaningful day on commencement day of my 25th reunion with my niece Malia, who was named for Malia Obama. She accompanied me. I was his escort for the whole day at commencement. He was our commencement speaker, and we got to spend the whole day with him. And it was just it was a magical day. And it was shortly before he passed, and he had cancer. We knew he had cancer, and he was. That was remarkable. But you know, there are lots of so many people. I mean, Ann Richards, the late Ann Richards. I always loved her. She was one of those people that every time I saw her in public, I never met her. I'd met her daughter, Cecile Richards. But I just actually taught Ann Richards last night. Taught a speech that she gave last night. So,
well, you talk about morally authentic leadership too, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Oh, that's so great. That's so great. And then lastly, what is something you are just loving in your life right now?
My new puppy.
Oh, Rogers!
New puppy. We have as I think you know, our first dog. So my husband and I have been married for almost 12 years. We'll be married 12 years this spring. And I met CJ. Actually, he was a graduate student at the Graduate School of Education a million years ago, long before I was on the faculty.
There was no overlap or no.
No, there was no overlap. That was not a creepy situation. But it was he was at the grad school, and I just come back from Columbia. I was still in grad school at Columbia, and I was teaching here. And that was right after 9/11. We met at a bar in Harvard Square 3 weeks after 9/11, or 4 weeks after 9/11. And so I met him then, which is interesting. So we got married much later on, and we got right before we got married, we had a black lab puppy named Jeter. I'm a big Yankees fan, as you know. And so our beloved Jeter passed right before Christmas. And it was fairly sudden. He had cancer, but we didn't know how bad it was.
Very quickly,
and really, we were just devastated. It ruined Christmas. And we were not going to get another dog, at least not right away. And then someone we know who knew that we had, sent us a picture of this very adorable chocolate lab who was like alone and hadn't been adopted yet. And so we were like, we're going to go get it. And so in February, which
is not a great month to adopt a puppy.
No. We're like middle of pandemic, middle of a New England winter, 2 months after losing our beloved dog, we're going to get a new guy. And so we did. And here he is. And he's his name is Rogers, as in Mr. Rogers, and he is nothing like Jeter. He is a handful. He is a cuddler. He's deeply manipulative, and he is like fearless and rebellious. And so like I can't get upset because I'm like all the things, right? He's all the things. Like I want people to be fearless and rebellious and cuddly, and
Coach Mac and Michelle are watching some, karmic.
So we are, but the one thing that CJ and I keep reminding ourselves is that, oh right, we were in our 30s when we had our last puppy.
Yes,
we are not in our 30s anymore. So anyway, but he's a delight, and he's bringing us a lot of joy, maybe a little bit more gray hair, but it's great. So that's bringing us real joy right now. Yeah.
I'm excited too, as you guys go into the spring and the summer. I just feel like Right. It's true. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. If you are listening at home or following along, Tim's newest book is Reckoning with History, Unfinished Stories of American Freedom. And this makes me think a lot about, I haven't read this particular book of yours yet, but I have ordered it. So now it's, how do we finish those stories, right? How do we pick up this legacy? And
that's up to us.
All of his books, I know, right? And we're getting older too. So young people out there, that's part of why I'm in education, right? Time for folks to giddy up and be ready to roll. So this was really great. And if you enjoyed hearing this and you want to see other lives on leadership or follow more of that, you can learn more at my website, which is bethnapleton.com, and sign up for my newsletter where I start posting these. It's always the first to know what's coming up. So bethnapleton.com/stay in touch. So it was so great to talk to him. Always such a pleasure. We have talked many times for many hours in many places, but never live on the internet. So
and it is, I just want to say, this is going to sound weird, but I'm so proud of you, and I'm so proud to know you. And it's so wonderful. We have known each other for a very long time, almost 30 years. And it's one of the great gifts in life is to have people that are, my husband talks about friends for a reason, friends for a season, friends for a lifetime. And I feel like, we were friends for a reason, and then we were friends for a season, and now we're friends for a lifetime. And those people like you are really precious. And the older I get, the more
it means.
I hold you close in my heart. So thank you for inviting me. This was lovely.
Oh my gosh, it was such a great time. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone at home for watching, and we'll see you soon.